I'm Scott Nethersole. I am part of the home team. I teach Italian Renaissance art here. I'm not Lloyd de Beer, as your program tells you. How much I think I'd really rather like being Lloyd for a day. Anyway, I am not. I'd also say before I introduce our speakers how pleased I am to have seen already that there seems to have been connections between what I'm hearing on clients' interests and what we've been hearing about connections in terms of breaking down of social hierarchies, connections in terms of transport, and unexpectedly in terms of swimming angels, which I hadn't expected at all. So our first session is entitled Material Foundations Between Nazareth and Loreto. And our first speaker is Margaret Meserve. She is the Glynn Family Honours Professor of History at Notre Dame, so she's a long way from home, but looking at her CV, it's very apparent that she has deep roots in British institutions. She is a historian of the Italian Renaissance, with particular interest in printing and book production with the history of the book, as well as an interest, or making important contributions to our understanding of the perception of Islamic empires perceptions from within Italy of Islamic empires. These are marked in her numerous publications, but most especially in two books, Empires of Islam in Renaissance Historical Thought, which came out in 2008, and just last year, Papal Bull, Politics, Propaganda and Print in Renaissance Rome, which came out with the Johns Hopkins University Press. She will also be known to a lot of us for her immensely useful and wonderful translations of Pius's commentaries for the Itati Renaissance Library. So please join me in welcoming Margaret to the stage. Actually, just to say, in terms of procedure, we're going to hear two papers and then there'll be questions afterwards to both speakers.
Great. Thank you so much for that nice introduction, and thank you again to the organizers for putting this fantastic program together. I will say that I think the PowerPoint didn't quite convert in some way, so that one word that is veiled by the image is in fact the word veils. And I'm going to hope that there aren't too many other weird captioning phenomena like that in my talk. So my interest in Loreto grew out of my interest in the printing history of its most famous early legend, the Transvalencio Miraculosa, composed by Pietro di Giorgio Tolomei sometime in the 1460s. We know that an early broadside of this text was printed in Florence in the mid-1480s, but no trace of that survives. The first surviving edition in an Italian translation dates to these same years, the mid-1480s, and the earliest, this is the one. The earliest surviving edition of the original Latin text dates to the late 1480s, and the text was then reprinted more than 40 times over the next half century, making it one of the most popular texts in the first century of printing on several measures. It was one of the most popular devotional works published anywhere and in any language in Europe in the, say, 1480s, 90s, and 1510s. It was one of the books most frequently printed in Rome. And it was one of the most popular books written by a recent author, a book made popular by printing rather than a book that had already had a public when printers began to print. So to me, the text was an interesting document for the history of popular or devotional printing in 15th century Italy. And as I was working on a book, as you've just heard, on the Renaissance papacy and the use of print in the Papal States, I found that the profusion of editions of the Transvalencio illuminated that story in interesting ways. Almost every edition of the Transvalencio Miraculosa that survives was printed in Rome. This is not entirely surprising. There was no press at Loreto, nor at nearby Recanati or Ancona in the 15th century. Instead, printers in Rome produced editions of the books in great numbers, and these were transported some 150 miles north to Loreto to be sold at the shrine. It's also fairly clear that they were sold in Rome itself and in other locations around Italy. These were short quarto pamphlets printed by the same group of printers who also produced devotional literature for pilgrims in Rome during the Jubilee and in other years. These printers, many working anonymously, also produced catalogs of indulgences, editions of the Mirabilia Romae, short histories of the city's pagan and Christian past, and so on. And these are just a few examples of their production. The printers of these books shared types and woodcuts, not only across their own editions, but with one another as well. And this meant that Marian images used in guides to Roman churches like Santa Maria Maggiore could also be used in editions of the Transvalencio Miraculosa. And these printed texts are often found bound with one another. So we'll have the legend of Loreto along with the indulgences of the city of Rome, the Mirabilia Romae, and other devotional works like the Orationes of Bridget of Sweden or the Confessionale of Andreas Escobar. Together, these editions point to a thriving industry in the papal city involving the printing, illustration, and marketing of devotional books, both in Rome and at the other end of the papal states, at Loreto. Along the way, as I was studying this production, I encountered some curiosities having to do with this text and its printing history that led me to think a bit more broadly about Loreto and how it worked as a site of devotional interest in the late 15th century. And it's these puzzles that I want to talk about today. So rather than thinking just about the printing history of the text, I will be focusing instead on the status of the original text of the Transvalencio, both as a literary production and as a material object, with a particular focus on its tactile connections to the Santa Casa itself. The Transvalencio is the first literary account we have of the legend of the Santa Casa. It explains how the little house shrine was originally the Virgin's house in Nazareth, the building where she was born and grew up, where she received the Annunciation from the angel Gabriel, and where she and Joseph returned to raise the Christ child within its walls. After the resurrection and ascension of Christ, and after the death of the Virgin herself, the disciples used to gather in the house, we're told, making the building one of the earliest churches in Christian history. And the text also relates how, at a certain point, Nazareth and the district around it, indeed the entire Holy Land, fell away from the Christian faith. The Virgin allowed her house to remain where it was, quote, for as long as the people in those parts were Christian. But after the people rejected their Christian faith and accepted the faith of Muhammad, then the angels of God carried the church away. Whisking the house away from Islamic oppression, the angels took it first to Dalmatia, as we've heard, then across the Adriatic to Italy, and finally onto the hillside of Loreto. It arrived sometime before 1296, Ptolemy says. The text concludes with accounts from several eyewitnesses who saw the house or worshipped at it when it first appeared in the Marche, and whose descendants had relayed their visions to the author of the text, Ptolemy. Ptolemy also notes that after the arrival of the house, a delegation of local citizens went to Nazareth to check whether the Virgin's house was still there. There were sort of already intimations, visions, angelic revelations that this house was Mary's, but they wanted sort of more scientific proof. So these 16 citizens were sent to Nazareth, and there they found a hole in the ground whose dimensions matched that of the building at Loreto, exactly. And they found a sign on the wall nearby saying that until recently the Virgin's house had stood there, but recently it had disappeared, and no one knew where it had gone. So Ptolemy included these testimonies in order to establish the authenticity of the house of Loreto, to certify that it was from Nazareth, and that a chain of witnesses could aver that it really had arrived through the air on angel wings, and to fix the date of its arrival within the memory of a few generations. The first curiosity is how to date both Ptolemy's text and the supposedly older legend that the text relays. Pietro di Giorgio Ptolemy of Teramo was rector of the church at Loreto from 1455 to his death in 1473. And sometime between 1467 and 69, a pilgrim from Brescia visited the site and recorded in his diary a version of this story. So we can more or less fix the composition of his tale between 1455 and 1469. Despite all the authorities and eyewitnesses he invokes, though, there is little evidence that the story of an itinerant house circulated much before Ptolemy. To be sure, Loreto had been a popular shrine, and earlier authorities like Flavio Biondo describe how pilgrims flocked to the site in order to fulfill vows, to thank the Virgin for graces received, or to ask for help, especially for medical cures. Pilgrims came to venerate a miraculous image of the Virgin in the little church at Loreto, and there seems to have been an earlier tradition that this image had been miraculously delivered to the site by angels. As late as 1471, Pope Paul II mentioned in a papal bull the belief that the Loretan image had come to the church in a crowd of angels. And early iconography of the Madonna di Loreto supports this notion of an cult image being delivered through the air by angels that sort of hold up its tabernacle. Before Ptolemy, however, there was little mention of a flying house. So it's possible that Ptolemy codified or even invented the legend at just this time. And perhaps it was because Paul II had started a campaign of new construction at Loreto. Perhaps Ptolemy wanted to protect small original shrine church from demolition by promoting its status as the sacred thing itself, that it was this thing that had flown to Italy, not the image inside it. This is a little speculative, but it's a possibility. And as we know, the shrine was preserved, and there it remains to this day. The legend took on extremely quickly. Poetic evidence from the 1470s and 80s, both printed and Romanian manuscript, repeat the story again and again. There's a new, as we've heard already, a new emerging iconography showing the house itself on the move with angelic help, with the Virgin and Child accompanying it in a kind of indeterminate or indistinct way. And of course, we have the great run of printed editions of the Transvalencio Miraculosa itself. But here I want to underscore again something you've already heard, the extraordinary variability of the iconography, even amongst editions, reprints, and reissues of this same text in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. So you can have images of the Sacra Casa on the move, but you can also simply have Marian images borrowed from other iconographies, all kind of standing in. And that, to me, suggests that the focus in these early years was really still on the Madonna and not the house. Ptolemy also published the text of his legend in a different and very immediate way that further underscored its supposed antiquity. Authors writing about Loreto in the 1470s, 80s, and 90s all report that they took their information from a very old and dusty tablet posted on the wall of the church at Loreto. Nicola da Monopolo visited Loreto in 1478 and said that he copied down the story from a parchment sign attached to a column in the church that was written in large letters on parchment paper. Bartolomeo da Vallombrosa, Battista Spagnoli, and Giuliano Dati all also retell the legend and make reference to this tablet or sign. So I think it's clear to me that the story was Ptolemy's invention, and so was the sign. Despite all the talk of how old and dusty and corrupt the sign was, it's probably likely that he himself had put it up during his tenure as rector of the church. So Ptolemy codified the story of the Santa Casa, including, if you'll recall, the detail of a sign on a building in Nazareth commemorating the departure of the house, and then he inscribed his tale on a new sign in Loreto commemorating its arrival and retailing its peregrinations. So here textual signs not only repeat the legend, but are also attested within the legend as tokens of proof or certifications of the authenticity of the place and its miracle. And I think another significance for the text is that of the contact that this text had had with the shrine itself. The original placard had hung inside the church, and it argued for the sanctity of the church. The text on the sign may have been considered something like a contact relic, an object that not only established the identity of the building, but also participated in that sanctity by being posted in direct contact with the walls. Pious pilgrims to Loreto reflected on the fact that here was the place that God had become incarnate in the body of the Virgin, and the place the Christ child had taken his first steps, the place where he had slept and ate and traced his childish fingers along its rough walls. Here spirit had touched flesh, and God became man. And here the God-man had touched stone. And later on, the house itself had touched down in Italy, transferring sanctity and effecting miracles with every pass. Ptolemy's sign, hung up on a column inside the church, was likewise engaged in this process of tactile transfer, broadcasting information about the building from the fabric of the building to visiting pilgrims who could then take away a copy of that short text as a record of their visit. I want to move on to the second part of my talk, so I'll only briefly mention that this idea of a text sanctified by contact with the Madonna di Loreto in her house persisted well into the 16th century. And I don't have an image of this text, but I want to mention a small collection of poems attributed to the Florentine humanist Paolo Attavanti, which consists of prayers in ottava rima addressed to the Virgin of Loreto. The earliest surviving edition we have is from 1525, and it consists of a versified version of Ptolemy's legend and various prayers. And the 1525 edition, printed in Venice, offers this descriptive title, that this is the legend and prayer which was found at the feet of Santa Maria di Loreto. Echoing the house's original miraculous appearance in Italy, the poem is said to have materialized at the feet of the Virgin at the base of her statue, possibly sent by the Madonna herself. And certainly it was this miraculous discovery that recommended the work to the readers. The poem was printed 7 more times in the 16th century. The Rimini edition of 1581 offers a further comment on one of the poems, namely that it had been found not just at the foot of the statue, but next to a priest whose heart had disappeared from his body. And with no more context in this, it's very hard to know exactly what to make of it, but the implication seems to be that the Virgin was continuing to effect these kind of miraculous appearances and leaving behind textual tokens of her encounters. This emphasis on the materiality of the story helps shed light on encounters between the faithful and the shrine in later centuries. I've suggested that printed accounts of the legend and prayers found, in prayers like these, derive some of their power not from the story they told, but from their proximity of their originals to the bricks and mortar of the shrine or to the material substance of the statue. Print also allowed the mass reproduction of more basic souvenirs of sacred contact at Loreto. From at least the 17th century on, pilgrims to Loreto could buy small printed envelopes filled with dust swept from the Holy House. These little paper packets, and I've actually brought one today, which I can show later, were usually printed on one side with words and a woodcut image. Care was taken to decorate and embellish the packets. Sometimes they were hand-colored, as you see here. Sometimes the printing was done in 2 colors. The paper was then folded, filled with dust, and sealed with wax, and as far as I can tell, they were not opened again after purchase. At some point, woodcuts gave way to engravings. As you can see here, a few more examples coming into the 19th century, and eventually engravings gave way to lithography. The packets were still being produced in the 20th century. Variation in the iconography echoes that we saw in the earlier printed pamphlets. Sometimes we have images of the Virgin and the house on the move. Sometimes we have images just of the cult statue, sort of in its ritual setting. Sometimes we have more architectural souvenirs of the outside screen or of Vitelli's entire complex. But always marked as dust from the sacred house, and kept safe and sometimes even framed and decorated for the domestic interior. These small objects allowed the faithful another way to stay in contact with the Holy House by borrowing a bit of that most domestic substance, dust, and enshrining it in their own homes. Dust from the Holy House also played a part in other media as well. For at least the early 17th century, potteries near Loreto produced cups or bowls made of clay mixed with dust swept from the house. Like the printed envelopes, these vessels were also marked with the phrase "con polvere di Santa Casa," sometimes abbreviated as you see here, on the outside or on the inside of the bowl, and they were painted with Loretan iconography in styles both sophisticated, well, let's say both simple and sophisticated. We see different designs, the Virgin and Child on the house, as you see here, but also, again, a new kind of emphasis on the cult statue wrapped in its festal vestments. The phrase "con polvere di Santa Casa" remains consistent even as we move into the 19th century, and the impulse emerges, 19th century, to try to craft the wording in the style of contemporary typography. So you see this kind of interplay between print and ceramics, and even though this is usually pretty unsuccessful and kind of unsatisfying as graphic design goes, you can see the kind of the way in which these souvenir images were crossing across different media. And we know that these were still being produced well into the 20th century as well. So we've seen in both the packets of dust and the bowls made of dusty clay that the iconography of Loreto continued to vary over the centuries. Pamphlets, packets, and bowls all alternate between offering an image of the Santa Casa in flight or the cult statue. I think it's fair to say over the 20th century the focus has shifted more firmly to the cult statue. And if you go to Loreto today and you try to buy a nice souvenir of some representation of the Santa Casa, they're actually quite hard to find. It's the little cult statue that predominates. And my final example exemplifies this trend. The division and distribution of veils that were draped over the statue during Lent, especially on Good Friday and Holy Saturday. Starting in the 18th century, these black silk drapes were cut up each year after Easter and attached with wax or glue to small printed cards that were then sold to the faithful. So again, we see the mass production and commodification of contact relics. But here, instead of contacts with the walls of the house, it's contact with the Virgin's image, the cult statue that was on offer. Printing technology provided the means to both reproduce and advertise these offerings. And in early examples, we see woodcut or engraved images and borders, as well as die-cut borders and embossing, wax seals, paper shapes covering the glue, manuscript signatures, and dates, and so on. And the layering in these objects of print, fabric, wax, glue, paper, and so on convey a heightened sense of the sanctity of the tiny scrap of material presented and preserved. As we move into the 20th century, the quality of the printed work becomes more mechanical and uniform, the veil more obviously a piece of synthetic mesh, the wax seal more clearly a prefabricated decal. Nowadays, the cards come in printed wax or glassine envelopes to protect the contact relic within. These continue to be produced at Loreto, and I brought one as well to show. So here we have another example. So the objects I've presented today don't completely align with one another. Tablets, books, prints, bowls, envelopes of dust, and scraps of cloth all function in slightly different ways as souvenirs of the sacred experience at Loreto. They represent the variety of ways that the faithful might choose to commemorate and perform their devotion to the Madonna and to her holy house. What they all have in common, I've argued, is their interest in communicating the experience of material contact with a holy site. The Laurentian Complex was sacred in many ways. The Virgin of the place had effected miraculous cures for centuries. The devout had prayed to her for help or rescue, and often came to fulfill vows made in moments of despair. Her cult statue was the focus of veneration for many, but her holy house came to occupy an equally important place in the hearts of the faithful as the Virgin's home, site of the Incarnation, a sacred but humble dwelling where heaven and earth, God and man, sacred and divine, had mingled in swirls of ordinary household dust. In the early modern period, new technologies of mass reproduction allowed pilgrims to carry away tokens of the experience of contact to be shared and preserved in infinite ways, in printed copies of legends, in miraculous verses, in household objects like cups and bowls, in printed envelopes holding scoops of dust, or printed cards fixed with veils of silk or net. Here, text and image were communicative but also talismanic, fusing commemoration and mystical communion, just as the Santa Casa itself had done when it lit on its distant hillside bringing a piece of the Holy Land to Italian soil.
Our next speaker is Emily Price, who is, like our previous speaker, also a historian. She currently holds a Iberhume Early Career Fellowship at Newcastle. In 2020, she took her PhD from the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor, with most importantly for us, a dissertation on the Holy House, entitled "Famous for Her Footsteps, Place, Proof, and the Holy House in England, Italy, and Scotland, 1450 to 1650. Her publications, both those that have come out and that are due shortly, as I understand, relate to this research and relate to her interest in travel particularly in wake of the Reformation, and particularly as revealed through travel literature, if I understand correctly. And I presume it's out of some of that we're going to hear her paper today, entitled "But Above All, We Desire to See Nazareth, Visiting the Site of the Annunciation After the Rise of Loreto."
Thank you for that introduction. All right, so on his way to the Levant in about 1553, the Spanish Franciscan Juan Pereira passed through the port of Ancona on Italy's Adriatic coast. In the narrative of his journey, Pereira mentioned that a basilica in the nearby town of Loreto claimed to possess the Holy House of the Annunciation. The house, he said, had been miraculously transported from Nazareth in order that it might be more plainly displayed. Later in his travels, he visited Nazareth, and there he noted, "Here was once the angelic house and celestial house, but now it is a house of robbers and murderers. Its inhabitants are Saracens. It was a lamentable thing to find such a town in this condition. Never had we seen anything so stony, so full of thorns and deserted." Pereira thus contrasted Loreto, accessible to and honored by pilgrims, and Nazareth, difficult to reach and controlled by enemies of the faith. Nevertheless, he chose to visit not the newer Italian site, but the house's original home. Even as the papacy honored the new European shrine, and despite the inherent difficulties in making the lengthy and dangerous journey to the Levant, many pilgrims chose to visit Nazareth. And what is more, those desiring to authenticate or to refute the Loreto house continued to ground their arguments in the physical fabric of the Holy Land. Pilgrims who were coming to Nazareth after the Ayyubid Sultanate recaptured the city in 1187 saw a basilica that was gradually crumbling into disrepair. In 1283, the Sultan allowed the Franciscan order to conduct masses at the church and to guide Western pilgrims around it. In the late 14th century, the order was permitted to build a friary and a hospice near the site. In the centuries thereafter, until 1620, when the Franciscans formally regained control of the site, Westerners were variously permitted and forbidden to visit the shrine. When they were allowed access to the site of the Annunciation, the pilgrims would descend beneath the ruins of the Crusader church, and then they go into this two-roomed grotto consisting of an antechamber and beyond a cave cut into the hill, which enclosed the remains of what's called Mary's house, as seen here in a mid-17th century guide, and then a modern view of what it looks like now. The first two Holy Land pilgrims to mention Loreto were the Milanese condittore Roberto di San Severino and the English priest William Way, both of whom traveled in 1458. Neither linked the chapel to Nazareth. Around this time, many pilgrims visited Nazareth, but not the Italian shrine, even those who sailed from the Holy Land from Ancona, which is of course only about 16 miles from Loreto. On the other hand, in 1480, shortly after the history of Loreto that Margaret was talking about began to circulate, an anonymous French pilgrim called the Italian Holy House, the chapel where the Virgin Mary stood when the angel Gabriel revealed that she would be the mother of the Son of God. And then when this pilgrim went to the Holy Land, he didn't visit Nazareth. However, we need to be cautious, of course, about drawing conclusions from whether or not a person visited Nazareth, because Western pilgrims were so often just unable to do so. The Dominican Felix Fabri and his companions, traveling around 1480, were prevented from reaching Nazareth, and they had to be content with a trip to the site of the Visitation instead. Fabri said that the pilgrims received on this spot all the joy which we should have felt at Nazareth. They were again thwarted when they couldn't afford to bribe the Saracens who controlled access to the city, and he expressed his irritation. But above all, we desired to see Nazareth. It is said nowadays to be a small village wherein no honor is shown to Christ or his servants, but of old, in the days of St. Jerome, it was the seat of an honored archbishopric. For Fabry, the town of Nazareth had lost its outward attractions, but was still an object of desire for the role it played in early Christianity, and above all, for the joys that would come from meditating on the Incarnation in that particular spot. Fabry was aware of the Loreto shrine. He mentioned that sailors and pilgrims evoked Our Lady of Loreto against shipwreck. But when the story of the Holy House's flight was already known outside of Italy, as it was when he wrote, he did not link the two places in his narrative, nor did he visit the shrine on his travels through Italy. While some pilgrims writing at about this time acknowledged Loreto as the house of the Annunciation, others, like a Frenchman visiting in 1532, simply referred to it as a chapel brought from near Jerusalem, which is interesting. These various narratives indicate that before the story of the shrine was codified in that first original written history that we know of, pilgrims had heard of Loreto, but did not necessarily identify the central relic as Mary's house, or indeed, as you suggest, think of the house perhaps as the central relic. After 1470, some pilgrims believed that the site where the Annunciation had taken place had been relocated to Italy, but they still wanted to see Nazareth. But as late as 1532, some pilgrims were still uncertain or mistaken about exactly what was being honored at Loreto. Protestant travelers to the Holy Land sometimes mentioned Loreto. In 1612, the Scottish Calvinist William Lithgow viewed the remains of the Crusader Church in Turkey, and I've included a picture of him in his Turkish traveling outfit. He's striding there across the ruins of Troy with his little stick. Standing before this ruinous lump, as he called it, with a party of Armenian pilgrims, Lithgow remarked that he had once seen what purported to be the original house in Italy. One of his companions responded, "We Armenians cannot believe that, neither many other assertions of the Roman Church. For we certainly know by Christians that have come from time to dwell here ever since, this is both the place and the stones of the house." And there Lithgow and the Armenians share a laugh at the gullibility of Roman Catholics. And moreover, like the Spanish Franciscan whose story I began with, Lithgow contrasted Loreto's full coffers with the sorry state of Nazareth's ruinous lump. If a shrine's gifts and votives were proof of its effectiveness, and if Nazareth was no longer so honored, was the original site worth a visit? In Italy, the Jesuit order in charge of the Loreto shrine from 1559 also reckoned with attacks on the Holy House's authenticity. The shrine's official histories from the earliest through the Torsolino 3-volume 1597 work, which I'm sure we'll all hear more about later, relate to how a party of pious citizens traveled to the Holy Land to compare Loreto's measurements to the foundations left behind in Nazareth. These fact-finding journeys were explicitly coded as pilgrimages, and I think that we can read this use of pilgrimage in the service of proof as a reaction against reformers who said that pilgrimages were idolatry, they divert funds for charity, and that they encourage you to be worldly. Although Protestants, of course, made journeys that, in terms of both sites visited and emotional reactions engendered, read an awful lot like Catholic pilgrimages, the Protestants often assert that they are not doing that at all. They're doing no such thing. In the introduction to a 1617 travel account, for example, an Englishman states pointedly, "I'm not conducting a pilgrimage, that's a practice for Turks and Catholics." The Loreto historians, in using pilgrimage as they did, argued not only that their relic was authentic, but that pilgrimage could be a deductive practice and not a superstitious one. Torsolino, a Jesuit, responded to Loreto's critics by citing older histories and his own archival work, but most of his arguments were grounded in the materiality of the Italian and Nazarene sites. And I argue that those arguments were direct challenges to the Franciscans, who were claiming that their special knowledge of the landscape of the Levant made them the best ones able to decipher it. Francisco Suriano, the head of the Franciscan order in the Holy Land, argued that the Loreto house was made of bricks and tiles and covered with jars, a style of building not found in Nazareth. And I'm so excited that Margaret mentioned the figs because I'm going to talk about them too. Suriano's mention of the jars is striking because, according to Torsolino, when the workers were repairing the house's roof, they found earthen vessels under the roof beams. And Torsolino suggested that these were the Virgin's own household objects, reverently preserved by the apostles. And this is an 18th century image that actually was made when Napoleon came and took over the shrine. He was cataloging all the things he was taking. And amongst the things he was taking were 3 of these vessels. Torsolino thus transformed what looked like an unfortunate anachronism into a further proof. The Loreto house's roof jars were evidence of its unique status, and in a larger sense, evidence that Jesuits could read material fabric just as skillfully as Franciscans could. One of the miracle stories most promoted by the Jesuits was that of the Converted Jew of Nazareth. It appeared frequently in souvenir woodcuts shown at the shrine. Here, a man kneeling in prayer outside the Holy House is identified as Iudo Facto Christiano. As told by Torcellino, a Jewish man lived near the Annunciation site. Influenced by his proximity to the sacred space, he came to reverence Mary while still following his own faith. Imprisoned by Muslim civil authorities, he called on the Virgin to save him. She appeared, freed him, and told him to go to Loreto to be baptized. When he reached the coast of Italy and told his story, all the townspeople clamored around him and wanted him to be baptized right then, but he refused and held off until he reached the Holy House. In this story, therefore, the Holy House's power to convert has moved from the Levant to Italy. The house's former presence in Nazareth has left behind enough holy residents to soften the man's heart, but in order to be truly saved, he had to travel to Loreto. Meanwhile, the Franciscan guardians of the original site weighed in on the debate over the authenticity of the shrine. And here's the full quote that I extracted from earlier, from the head of that holy order, Francesco Sciuriano, writing in about 1524. The house where the Virgin dwelt, and in which the Annunciation by the angel took place, some wrongly have said to be St. Mary of Loreto, which is made of bricks and tiles and covered with jars, and such things are not found in this country. The real house, then, of the Blessed Virgin is cut in the mountain, which is of tough rock and is underground. And that same house that was there at the time of the Annunciation is there at present. And it cannot be transported or lifted unless you carry off the mountain. And in these contemporary images, you can see how the area that's known then and now as Mary's Grotto is cut into the hillside. Sciuriano's arguments emphasize the disjunct between the materiality of the Loreto house and the place from which it was supposed to have come, and on the survival of the original site. To some, Nazareth might appear to be a confused ruin, but Sciuriano's intimate familiarity with the landscape allowed him to correctly interpret it, and thus to counter Loreto's claims. Similar proof based on materiality were advanced by lay pilgrims. For example, Greffin Effegart, a French Catholic knight writing in 1534, thought that the fabric of the shrine didn't appear Nazarene. He wrote, "Some have wanted to say that this aforementioned chamber was taken up and isn't present in Our Lady of Loreto in Ancona, but this seems to me a gross exaggeration. I cannot believe that it is the chamber of the Annunciation, because the stones do not appear to be from the Levant. The Loreto cell is made of brick, which material is not found in any part of the country of Galilee. In Nazareth in particular, it's not necessary because there's a foundation of rock. The aforesaid chamber is in part inside the rock, which serves as its wall." And I put the two quotations next to each other here to emphasize their similarity. I suspect that the lay pilgrims were told a standard sort of talking point by the Franciscan guides about why Loreto was not. I can imagine some of them bringing up Loreto while they're at the shrine, but what about Loreto? And Effegart here seems to absorb the same message that Sciuriano was putting forth. As Catherine Holmes has demonstrated, late medieval pilgrims could and did visit the Holy Land without the intervention of the Franciscans, and many pilgrims even traveled with their own chaplains or took tours led by non-Catholics. And I argue that because of this inability to completely control the narrative told about these places, the Franciscans at Nazareth were particularly eager to impress upon their visitors their critique of Loreto. The guardians of the holy sites of the Levant were, after all, in a difficult position. They had to balance the official stance of the Holy See, that the Loreto relic was the house of the Annunciation, with their devotion to the original site, and of course their need to continue to attract pilgrims. Moreover, the Franciscans had to accomplish this while being periodically banished from the shrines by the Ottomans. Their ability, therefore, to decipher the Nazarene landscape argued for the preeminence of their site as a pilgrimage destination and of their order as its guardians. Some Franciscans addressed the problem of Loreto by proposing an alternative reading of the landscape. The 1577 narrative of Boniface of Ragusa, an Italian Franciscan who was in residence at Nazareth, named the grotto underneath the basilica as the place where the Annunciation had taken place. He then identified a nearby church dedicated to St. Gabriel, this is it today, as enclosing the foundations of the house within which Mary and Joseph raised the infant Christ. I say the foundations, he says, because it is reported that the house, by the will of God, is now in Italy and is called the Santa Maria di Loreto. He thus attempted to allow for Mary's house having been translated to Italy, while suggesting that the physical space within which the Annunciation took place was still in Nazareth. The St. Gabriel Church was, and indeed is today, under the care of Eastern Orthodox Christians. As you may know, they hold that Mary was first greeted at the well, which they preserve here, by the angel. And so I think we can see here the Franciscans knowing about this alternative Annunciation tradition and using it to reconcile the long history of worship at their site with the flight to Loreto. The situation was further complicated when they regained control of Nazareth in 1620. Before the friar Tommaso Obbicini left Italy to head his order's takeover, he visited Loreto and noted the dimensions of the Holy House. Once he was settled in at Nazareth, he confessed that he could not dismiss his doubts from his mind. It certainly seemed impossible to me, he wrote, that a larger site could fit over a smaller site, and that a narrower could contain a broader. In short, the Holy House of Loreto was bigger than the Nazarene footprints. Obbicini confirmed this discrepancy using a floor plan of the Holy House that he had obtained from Rome, similar to this one. However, in restoring the grotto, one of the Franciscan brothers broke up part of the paved floor. Examining the exposed ground, he exposed a different set of foundations underneath the old ones, long hidden from view. He measured them, and he found that they accorded exactly with the dimensions given in this plan of the Loreto house. Obbicini's house doubts melted away. It matched place to place, site to site, space to space, in his evocative phrase. He rejoiced that divine grace had led him to this new and definitive proof of the miraculous translation. Because of his hesitation, Obbicini compared himself to someone else we've heard about today, the original doubting Thomas, the disciple who had to touch the wounds on Christ's body before he could believe in the resurrection. In his account, Obbicini stated that God with his grace demonstrated that which without faith we could not have understood. Like Thomas, Tommaso was given physical proof for something that he should have been able to accept with faith alone. While faith that did not require physical proof was preferable, the story of doubting Thomas indicates that Christ realizes the human desire to find such proofs. The continuing practice of using Nazareth to prove Loreto's authenticity should thus be understood in the context of the Franciscans reclaiming full custody of the site, and in particular their cleaning, repairing, and reinvigorating worship at it. Obbicini's story of his struggle and reconciliation suggests that some devout Catholics still harbored doubts that Loreto was authentic. In the 13th century, the House of the Annunciation fled to Europe, where its city came under Muslim rule. In the 17th century, when the house was returned to Christian control, the house's authenticity could be validated and reconciliation between the two sites achieved. Obbicini's doubts were laid to rest with the help of a Rome-printed blueprint of a Jesuit-controlled chapel. But the final proof stemmed from the authority of the Holy Land, as interpreted by the Franciscans. In sum, both devotees and detractors of the Holy House continued to visit, analyze, and lay claim to the Levantine landscape, indicating the continued importance of the materiality of the Holy Land in European thought and practice between the end of the Crusades and the rise of the Grand Tour. Thank you.